I love the book of Hebrews. I love being in the book of Hebrews. More than 25 years ago, I memorized it. I went to the woods with my dogs and I put the book of Hebrews inside me. I was drawn by the puzzles that it seemed to offer, the mystery. I loved the rich theology. I loved the dramatic power that it seemed to have and the way it impacted me. Then I put it on stage. I made it into a dramatic presentation so that I could share it with people. And I learned a lot of things about the book of Hebrews. And I can't wait to share some of those treasures with you. There was a season, I remember I used to say, I'm working on the book of Hebrews. And then one day I remember thinking about it, and I remember thinking, that's not really fair. You're not working on the book of Hebrews as much as the book of Hebrews is working on you. The way the book of Hebrews has worked on me is the journey that I most want to share. It's called Listen and See. Thank you for walking on this journey with me. Now, if you want to understand the book of Hebrews, one of the best places to begin is with the study of rhetoric. I'm going to show you an example of ancient Greco-Roman rhetoric. My hope is that by experiencing a little bit of rhetoric as it impacts you, you're going to be in a better position to understand what rhetoric is. Albert Van Oy was one of the most important scholarly voices in the book of Hebrews in the 20th and 21st century. He was born in 1923 and he passed in 2021. In his monograph, A Different Priest, Cardinal Van Oy maintained that without a rhetorical lens, you will fundamentally misunderstand the author's intent. You see, Cardinal Van Oy and others like him looked into the sophisticated prose of the book of Hebrews and identified within it rhetorical structure, rhetorical devices that gave evidence to the reality that Hebrews was written to be spoken out loud. It was written to be heard. Now, if you lived during the time Hebrews was written, and if you could learn how to read and how to write, you could catapult yourself into the top 20% of people. It was thought that between 5 and 20% of people could read and write at some level of proficiency. But if you had a little more money, if you had a little more time, if you had the freedom to focus yourself on rigorous study, if you could leave behind grammar and pursue and focus on logic, if you could master logic and begin the craft and the artistry of rhetoric, where you learned and studied how to shape ideas and words into color and texture, into persuasion, into a level of mastery that allowed you to move an audience. Rhetoric, specifically the mastery of rhetoric, was the superpower of the elite. Hebrews represents that level of mastery. Now, Cardinal Vanoy is not alone in recognizing the rhetorical design and devices within the book of Hebrews, but he is probably one of the most bold. Consequently, Vanoy says, it is not only useful but indispensable to submit this text, the text of Hebrews, to rhetorical analysis if one wishes to interpret it correctly. To proceed any other way leads to dead ends. Only rhetorical analysis makes it possible to follow correctly the movement and detail of its expression. There is a story about two orators of antiquity, Aeschines and Demosthenes. It was said of Aeschines that when he finished speaking, that the crowds would cry out, "What a great speech!" But when Demosthenes finished speaking, the crowds would cry out, "Let us march." Now, the story is normally told as an illustration of the difference between the floral design, the artistry of eloquence, set against the power, the authority of persuasion, the ability to move an audience. You see, it must have seemed astonishing to some that you could open a scroll and in some sense embody the words and ideas that someone else wrote down many miles away and perhaps many years ago. But Hebrews represents a kind of astonishment that is far greater, an astonishment of shaping words and ideas with color and with texture and with persuasion. Hebrews represents this high level of education, high level of rhetorical mastery. And now, I'd like to show you an example of this kind of rhetoric, the rhetoric that we'll discuss in this video. I want you to pay attention to a couple of things. Firstly, I want you to pay attention to how the words impact you. Do you have an emotional response or a pensive response? And secondly, with regard to how hard, how difficult, how easy it is to follow the train of thought. And we'll come back in just a moment and talk about it. For anyone who's ever sensed that life is like fragments that refuse to fit together, promises that seem delayed, questions that remain unanswered, prayers that appear suspended in silence, long stretches of waiting in which the destination seems hidden even though the journey continues at full speed, and a persistent feeling that there must be a larger meaning connecting all of the pieces, even though it cannot yet be seen. The book of Hebrews offers not merely an explanation, but an invitation to listen until you can see. But that invitation is not offered to people standing comfortably distant. Hebrews speaks to participants, to people under pressure, to the weary, to people who have begun the journey. Hebrews speaks to those who feel the weight of continuing the journey in the face of opposition. The book is not calling to curious readers to solve a literary puzzle. Hebrews speaks to weary listeners to keep on listening, to exhausted travelers to keep on walking when stopping now seems necessary, reasonable, prudent. It matters because the journey from hearing to seeing, and that is the journey that the Hebrew writer is trying to take us on. It's not automatic. It requires attentiveness. It requires endurance. It demands the kind of faith that keeps on listening, not after, but before the whole image comes into view. Thank you for taking a moment to watch that short example of Greco-Roman rhetoric. I want us to focus on the very first sentence, that very long first sentence. And I want to ask you this question. What did you feel? What did you experience during that first sentence? I'm going to guess that at least at the beginning, you connected at some level with the words, the images, maybe even the emotions. But as the sentence grew long, you discovered difficulty holding it all together, difficulty of knowing exactly where the trajectory of the sentence was going. That's because the structure itself was designed to delay. The rhetorical device used is intended to suspend resolution for effect until the final phrase, which is designed to fully illuminate all of the previous phrases, is placed. Now, ancient rhetoricians had a name for this kind of communication. They called it periodic prose, or the periodic style. Greek periodic prose, or periodic style, refers to a sophisticated method of writing in which a sentence is constructed through a series of interdependent clauses that build toward a single unified climax. So, rather than putting forward the main idea initially, quickly, the periodic sentence delays resolution. It forces the listener to hold together meaning from all of the interdependent clauses and trust that the sentence will eventually cohere. It will eventually make sense. Now, most of us are much more familiar with a very natural style of communication. We're going to call that a running style. In a running style, the main point is given early, and then detail is added. The running style is direct, it's efficient, and it's clear. If I were to say to you, Hebrews is an important message for today, for believers today, because it encourages the weary believer. And then I spent the next couple of minutes explaining what exactly that means. I'm using a running style. You know where you're headed. The destination is clear. A running style is a little bit like driving across Kansas on a clear day. You can see the road stretching out ahead of you. The destination might be far, but there's no wondering. There's no drama. There's no suspense. The horizon is visible. The journey is measured by distance, not by discovery. Most people listen, learn, share in this natural style of communication. We expect teachers and pastors and our favorite YouTube channels to state the point, explain the point, move to the next point. Periodic style works differently. Periodic style does not reveal. It postpones that main idea. What the hearer is required to do is to continue listening while the details are accumulating, while the questions are emerging, while the emotions are intensifying. The meaning might be getting clearer, phrase by phrase, but the full significance remains just out of reach until the final phrase arrives. A running style emphasizes immediate clarity, but a periodic style uses delayed clarity to create an experience. Periodic style demands patience and trust until the final phrase. Until the final phrase arrives, earlier phrases may feel incomplete, suspended, waiting, or mysterious. The hearer continues to listen because he patiently trusts the speaker. Let me say that another way. Built into this ancient rhetorical device is a requirement that the listener exercise patience and trust in the speaker. Now, what if this rhetorical device is connected in some meaningful way to the message the writer is trying to tell? It is my proposal that the Hebrew writer is intentionally telling a story and connecting that story with the rhetorical way in which he is telling it. In other words, the form becomes the function. The writer is using periodic structure to delay the climax. That is the theological and rhetorical experience: endurance, faith, waiting. The rhetorical structure is deliberately shaping the journey of faith. Hebrews is not merely delivering efficient information. That is reserved for a running style. It is training the hearer to carry the fragment until the full meaning becomes visible. That is what periodic prose is and does. So the question is not, why does Hebrews seem complicated or mysterious or elusive? The better question is, what kind of experience is Hebrews trying to create? Hebrews is forming people to live faithfully between promise and possession, between hearing and seeing, between shadow and reality, between the fragment and the final phrase. When I gave you an example of a periodic sentence, it took less than a minute. Consider the scope of God and His historical periodic sentence. The shape is the same. The grammar of the sentence begins with a clause, adds another clause, a third clause, maybe more, and eventually the final phrase. But God, across the ages, spoke to Israel in true but incomplete fragments or phrases, promises, covenants, prophetic words. God's people carried those fragments, those words, those phrases through generations of waiting. The act of listening to a periodic sentence feels strangely familiar. It resembles the experience of living by God's promises before they appear. So perhaps the first lesson Hebrews has for us is surprisingly simple. Keep listening. We do not have to see the full picture before trusting the God who is speaking. We can carry the promise before we possess it. And we can live faithfully while the pieces still feel incomplete. Because the one who began the sentence can be trusted to bring it to its proper end. And that, I think, is where the journey of Hebrews really begins. In the next episode, we're going to the first words of the prologue. In the past, God spoke. And we're going to begin asking what happens when all of the fragments of God's former speech are finally heard in light of the sun. Until then, keep on listening. The picture is still coming into view. Now, when the next video of the Hebrew series is ready, I'll post it right there. Until then, please enjoy the story of Hosea and God. I'll put it right there.